With the .NET SDK installed, you should be able to use the Command Line Interface, or CLI. From any terminal or command prompt or PowerShell window, run .NET-help, and you should see some of the things that you can do. If I scroll to the top where this output started, you can see the version and basic usage. We're mostly going to be using the SDK commands, which involve the second pattern of usage here. Then the various commands that we can use are listed at the bottom of the output. To create a new project, we'll use the .NET New command. And if we want to see the different things we can create, you can type .NET New --list. That shows us a lot of different things, from an empty web project to an API, and also includes the MVC template that we'll be using. To find out more about these other templates, check out that big picture course I mentioned earlier. I'll clear the screen to make it easier for you to see what I'm typing here, but now we'll create our project. Find a place to put your project and create a directory for it. I'm in a demos directory on my machine here, and I'll create a new directory called carvedrock-admin, and then I'll change directories into it. Then we can use the .NET New command with the MVC template and give our new project a name with the -n parameter. Let's use carvedrock.admin in Pascal case, which is words with leading capitals. That's pretty common for C# and .NET projects. Pascal case for projects, namespaces, classes, and properties. That gives us some notes that things have happened successfully, so let's open VS Code here and have a look. I'll type code dot and that does the trick. There's one folder, and that's the Pascal case carvedrock.admin. And we just got a notification that some required assets to build and debug the application are missing. I'll choose Not Now, but we'll come back to this in the next clip. The program.cs file is what contains the entry point for the application, and it defines some services that can be used via dependency injection, we'll add more before too long here, and middleware, which is basically the HTTP pipeline execution. At the bottom of the middleware section, you can see the wire up for controller routes, which establish convention-based routing for our MVC app, the controller name and the action, and both have default values, home and index respectively. The csproj file is what's referred to as the project file, and that contains any external NuGet packages that the app uses, and the runtime framework and build information. There aren't any external packages now, we'll be adding some before too long, and you can see that the target framework is .NET 6, and then it's using the Web SDK. The app settings files are one place where you can provide configuration, and the development version of the file is used for overrides to the base configuration when we're in a development environment. Skipping over the www.root folder for a sec, this is an MVC project, which stands for Model View Controller, and not surprisingly, we have folders for those things: controllers, models, and views. The controllers folder has a single home controller, and since the default controller in the mapped routes we saw in program.cs is home, this is going to be invoked by default, and the index action is the default here too. There's also a privacy action and an error action. All of these return views, and we'll see the views folder in just a sec. The models folder contains any class definitions for the application or data content we'd like to show in a view. Right now, there's only a view model for errors. The properties folder has a file called launchsettings.json, which is used by IDEs when we run and debug the app. We'll come back to this in the next clip too. The views folder has a couple of subfolders, home and shared. The shared folder has a file called _layout, and this defines the overall layout for the site, the basic HTML structure for every page. Inside this layout, we'll see it in a bit, is a placeholder where each view gets rendered, but each page will be structured this way unless we specifically override it. The home folder has the views that correspond with the home controller, namely index and privacy. These are matched by convention. The folder needs to match the name of the controller without the word controller, and the file matches on the method name inside the controller. If you're wondering why the error view is in the shared folder instead of home, the convention for view matching always includes the shared directory after trying the directory for the controller name. The view imports and start are just some helpers that enable some initial syntax and simplification in our views, nothing we need to touch or worry about. Finally, there's the www.root directory, and this contains static assets that will be used on our website. There's CSS and JS directories, which is where we can put any CSS or JavaScript that we create and want to include. And then there's the lib folder, and this includes some already minified and pulled JavaScript libraries, Bootstrap, jQuery, and some jQuery validation. These are included directly rather than using NPM or any other kind of package manager and then needing to install them. But that's the whole project that we just created by the .NET New command with the MVC template. Now let's look at how to run and debug it. Let's run and debug our new application from VS Code. To start this demo, I've closed and reopened VS Code to re-trigger this notification to show up. It's telling us that we're missing required assets to run and debug. I'll click Yes. What this actually does is create the .VS Code folder and put a couple of files into it, launch.json and tasks.json. And if you didn't happen to see the notification or wanted to do this a different way, you can choose the Debug tab, and then there are options to add a configuration or set up Run and Debug. The launch.json file defines launch configurations that VS Code uses to start your app if you use its Run and Debug feature. This first configuration is called .NET Core Launch Web, and the name here is just a name. I'll change it to .NET Run/Debug just to show you what I mean. You can set environment variables that the app will use in this env section, and the only other thing worth pointing out is the pre-launch task, which is build. Any of the pre-launch tasks should be defined in tasks.json, and build is the first one. It uses the .NET CLI with the build command. So we have things that'll build and launch the application locally, but to see what ports are going to be used, that's controlled by the properties launch settings.json file. The default file that was created included some settings for IIS and IIS Express, which we won't need at all. So I'll get rid of the IIS settings, then the non-HTTPS endpoint for the app in the carvedrock.admin profile, and finally I'll get rid of the IIS Express profile. Getting rid of these isn't strictly required, but this simplifies our local setup a bit more and shows you exactly what's in play. When we launch it, our app should be on HTTPS on port 7108 as shown here. To make sure you can actually run with HTTPS, the .NET CLI has a command to make it easy, at least for local development. It's .NET dev-certs HTTPS, and if we pass --help, you can see some of the different commands and options. Run .NET dev-certs HTTPS-T to trust the local dev cert. I've already done this, and it's trusted, so I get a message that says it's already here. If you haven't done it before, you're likely going to get prompted to trust a local cert, and you should do that. Now we're ready to go, and just for grins, I'll go into the home controller and put a breakpoint on the index method. To run the application with our configuration, choose the Run and Debug tab in VS Code, and then notice that the configuration is the .NET Run Debug option, the name that we supplied in that launch.json file. You can hit the green play button, or F5 if you like shortcuts. This will build and run the application. And when it starts, we immediately hit our breakpoint since it's the default action of the default controller. Nice! I'll just hit continue here, and the site comes up. The privacy page works without a breakpoint, so all is good. And note that we're on port 7108 with HTTPS and a happy little lock symbol. Setting up hot reload using .NET Watch with VS Code can be a real time saver if you're doing some iterative work on the views. We're looking at the home view here, and I'm going to add some markup that'll show a simple Bootstrap alert on the page. It's using the Bootstrap CSS classes, and recall that Bootstrap was included in our template. It's in that www.root lib folder. If we go look at the tasks.json file now, there's actually already a watch task defined. This is great. In the launch.json file, we can copy the .NET Run Debug configuration block and paste it into a new one. Once we've done that, just change the name to .NET Watch and the pre-launch task to Watch. Easy enough. It'd be awesome if that's all we needed to do here, but there's a small tweak we need to make to the Watch task definition as well. We need to add an options property and then set a current working directory value to the carvedrock.admin subfolder. I'll add this following comma, and that should do the trick. Now I'll go back to the Run and Debug tab, and I can choose .NET Watch from the Launch dropdown and run it. Our new Bootstrap alert shows up just fine, which is great. I'll set this browser side by side with VS Code with that home index view opened. And now I'll add some text, all of the, in all caps, so you can see it easier. And when I press Ctrl S to save the file, you can see in the terminal window that it shows a file changed, and then a hot reload, and our browser now shows the updated content. This is really a nice productivity boost if you're making lots of UI changes. To stop things, you not only have to hit stop in the debug tools, but also Ctrl C in the terminal window where the watch is happening. I mentioned earlier that you'll want to have either Visual Studio or JetBrains Rider installed in order to do some work with scaffolding that we'll see later. I'm showing this page at visualstudio.microsoft.com to clarify this a bit for Visual Studio. There are three main options, and the one on the right is actually VS Code, the one we've been working with already. To get a more heavyweight and feature-rich IDE for .NET apps, you can choose one of the left two options based on whether you're on a Windows machine or a Mac. If you're on Windows, there are actually three different choices. The Community Edition is free and works fine for everything that we'll do. I'll be running the Enterprise Edition, but won't use any features that aren't in the Community Edition. If you've installed Visual Studio, you'll see an intro dialog that prompts you to clone a repo or open a project or solution, and some other options. Let's open the project we just created. I'll navigate to our folder, choose the CSproj file, and then click Open. This may take just a second, but you'll soon see a Solution Explorer that'll show the same files we were reviewing earlier. To run the application, just hit the play button at the top menu bar or hit F5. This will build and run the application just like we saw, and while that's starting up, I'll add a breakpoint to the privacy method in the home controller. Our page has come up and again uses that same port of 7108 for HTTPS due to that launch settings JSON file in the properties folder. And when I hit the privacy link, we stop in the debugger. I'll hit continue and it shows the page. Nice. One final thing to point out is that when you close Visual Studio, you'll see that it's created a solution file with the SLN extension that it prompts you to save. A solution file can be handy when working in both Rider and Visual Studio if you have more than one project you're working with for, well, the solution, or the application that you're developing. If you anticipate developers wanting to work on this app from any IDE, it's good to save this solution file. We'll be back to Visual Studio later in the course, but now let's have a quick look at Rider. Rider is a cross-platform IDE for .NET, so it runs on both Windows and Mac machines. It's a licensed product, but has a 30-day trial. If you're accustomed to IntelliJ or RubyStorm or other IDEs from JetBrains, this may be a good option for you as the full-featured IDE for .NET. If you've installed it, when you launch it, you're going to see a familiar dialog where you can open something to start. Once again, let's open the Carved Rock admin project we just created. I'll click Open, navigate to our directory, and double-click the CSproj file. Alternatively, you can click the SLN file as well. This will ask me about trusting the project, and I'll choose Trust and Open. There's our Carved Rock admin folder, and all of the same things we've just seen. I'll open the home controller, and again put a breakpoint in the privacy method. In the top right, there are buttons you can use to debug it and run it without debugging. I'll hit the debug one, and you can also use Alt F5. This builds and runs our app and starts it on HTTPS with the same port of 7108. And when I click the privacy link, we indeed hit our breakpoint. So now we've seen that we can load and run our project from any of these IDEs. We'll focus on VS Code, but we'll use Visual Studio and Rider in a couple of select places. And while we've already made a minor change with that Bootstrap alert on the home page, it's time for us to move on and create some code that'll start us down the road of our product maintenance app, mainly some starting code for new controllers, views, and models.